Morning, Year 10, Mr. Blower here again with more bad jokes and exciting analysis of Shakespeare's Macbeth. Before we get cracking with the first part of today's lesson, you'll remember yesterday I started with thinking about subjects that Shakespeare's work relates to. So whether that's history, psychology, philosophy, sociology, we saw that Shakespeare's work, well, hopefully we saw that Shakespeare's work is more than just English literature. It has connections with a wide range of subjects. Now, when it comes to GCSE English, we have our key reading skills. And I wanted to link those this morning to some careers that you might pursue in the future. If you're like me at the moment, sat at home and maybe questioning what the purpose of all of this is, we need some direction. We need a sense of where we're going. So when we're back at school and when we've left school in the future and we're heading off into the world of work, we've got something to focus for and aim towards. And the key reading skills that I'm about to go through all contribute or are all skills that are required in some of the careers that I'll point out. So first of all, we have selecting details. So we look at a text, we pick out key information, job done. Until we then get to the point of analysis. So we've picked out those bits of information from the text. We're now going to analyze them. We're going to explore them. We're going to comment on their meaning. We then go from analysing those details and looking at individual sections of a text to evaluating the big picture, a more challenging skill that, as I mentioned last time, is in the top band of the mark scheme for GCSE. Now, in terms of evaluating that big picture, you might be looking at a character and how they progress across the course of a play, or it might be taking a broad theme like the supernatural or appearance versus reality and thinking, okay, so where does that start? How does that develop? What's that like at the end? And what impact does that leave the audience with? So careers linked to these skills, because it's not just English literature that requires this of you. If you're thinking about going into law in the future, then all of these abilities to analyse, to select details, to evaluate will be really important. Similarly, psychology, counselling, if you're going to want to be a psychotherapist or a psychiatrist, important skills for you to develop. Journalism, again, what do journalists do? Well, they select details, they find information, they analyse it, and they produce an article or a report that evaluates the big picture. The police, particularly police detectives, again, they're going to need all those skills to be successful in that work. Football data analysts. Now, if you hadn't had your attention grabbed by any of those previous careers, maybe you're more interested in kicking a ball round than flicking through a 400-year-old play script, then you could work in sports analytics. And data analysts would do these three things. They'd select details, they'd analyse them, they'd evaluate the big picture. Finally, what I thought of is any sort of computer programming. Maybe you could extend that in terms of working with facts and figures and numbers and data to working in banking, becoming a hedge fund manager, becoming a stockbroker, God forbid. In which case you will need to select details, analyse them and evaluate the big picture, make decisions. And from that, you can have a happy, successful and in many senses, profitable career. So I hope that's given you a sense of the purpose of what we are learning, why we're learning it, and how it might be useful in the future. Now on with today's lesson. So the title is going to be Exploring Act 1, Scene 2. And as I said, this is going to be a two-part lesson because the first part's looking at Act 1, Scene 2. The second part is looking at Act 1, Scene 3. Now, across the next few weeks, you won't look at every single scene in as much detail as we're looking at these opening three. But at the start of a play, characters, themes, settings, and key plot features are being established and developed. So it is important that we look at these first three scenes in quite a lot of detail, quite a lot of forensic detail. And then you've got those skills and you've got that focus for when you look at the rest of the text, maybe more independently later on. So as always, you'll need your Macbeth notebook or file. You'll need a copy of Act 1, Scene 2 that was attached on Show My Homework. And as I do now, there are three questions for you to answer. First of all, what makes someone heroic? Secondly, what qualities would you expect in a king? And I know you've done some work on context when you looked at kingship and chivalry, the chivalric tradition. And number three, what would you expect to find in a report on a dramatic event? Maybe think back to that idea of becoming a sports analyst. People write reports on sporting events all the time. What would you expect to find in a report on a dramatic event, say a World Cup final? There's a challenge there for those of you that are willing and able to take it on. And that's a kind of alternative to doing the 3 questions. So pause the video, make your choice, and spend a few minutes completing that task. Okay, now you've had the chance to do the do now. If you remember yesterday, we were looking at witches as a starter and thinking about building our vocabulary around that word so that we've got a range of words that we can use to describe witches and their behaviour when we write about them or when we write about the supernatural. So today, we're focusing on the idea of heroes, heroic behaviour, and on kings. So let's have a look at words we might associate with heroes. Maybe there's the common assumption out there that they might be male. I think if you look at your standard Marvel adventure or your standard superhero comic, then the men outweigh the women, quite incorrectly in my opinion. Then we have the idea of physical strength, that they may have superhuman powers. They can do things that other people just can't do. They're brave, so they've got that kind of mentality where they'll do things, they'll take risks, and they will kind of sacrifice themselves in doing so. They might be a leader, okay? They might represent a group. They might drag other people along with them. They might inspire that kind of confidence and trust from others. They might be defined by their actions. So we don't usually associate heroes, certainly not in a superhero sense, with their words, but more with what they do. There are other kinds of heroes, obviously, and many of them do inspire with their words. But maybe we think about them being defined by their actions. Often they're respected, linked to the idea of leadership. People look up to them. Usually we just think a hero is someone who is a force for good, someone who makes a positive change in the world, and they are morally virtuous. Well, that sounds quite fancy, but that essentially just means that they do the right thing. They know the difference between right or wrong, and they make the right moral choices. They're selfless. Okay, they don't necessarily act in a heroic way for themselves to get glory and fame and status. They do it for others. Maybe they've got a cape, and maybe, as Superman and others, they wear their pants on the outside of their tights. Now then, on to kings. What would we expect a king to be? By the way, if you've got things that aren't on these lists, you can add some of these words to your own lists. You can reject my ideas altogether, or you can just carry on. In terms of kings, we think possibly they'd be fair. Okay, they'd be just. They'd treat people equally. Honest. Again, physically strong, maybe not as commonly associated with kings as maybe with heroes, but we would expect a king to be able to hold their own in a bout of fisticuffs. Leads from the front. Okay, that's a similar trait to what we saw over in our heroes. They might have a commanding voice or stature. So we said that heroes are defined by their actions. Well, maybe kings in a slightly more sort of political, symbolic role would be defined by their ability to command attention through their voice, through the way they stand. They talk first and they talk most. So we maybe expect kings to dominate again through their speech and other people just to sit there and listen. Like a hero, we would expect, we'd hope that a king would be respected. I expect a king or queen would certainly hope to be respected. A force for good, morally virtuous. Same applies for the hero. Maybe we'd expect a king to be generous. And in being generous, actually empowering others. That might be by giving them titles or different roles to play. It might actually be by making them feel confident and feel that they can achieve something greater than what they thought originally. We might expect a king to be intelligent, knowledgeable, and wise. Maybe that contrasts with our sort of more physically heroic character on the left. Here we're expecting someone who's maybe a bit older, a bit wiser, a bit smarter possibly. And then one maybe negative aspect that we could apply to heroes or kings is that idea of being egotistical. Okay, so the idea of that sort of status, that sort of power, especially if in Elizabethan and Jacobean times, you genuinely believed that you were appointed to a role by God, that might lead to you being slightly egotistical and thinking you're kind of above other people. Now, being egotistical, we'd often think would be a bad thing. It'd be something that could lead to your downfall if you're too big-headed. But it can be something positive. It can be something that drives your ambition. Now, as a teacher in a secondary school in England, I shouldn't be making political comments, and I won't. But there might be a political leader, possibly the political leader in this country, possibly now, who grew up actually saying and stating and thinking that he would become world king. So growing up with the belief that he would become, in his words, world king. Now, he might not be world king, but he's certainly risen to great heights today. Now, again, for balance, I'm not saying that that's a good thing or a bad thing, and I'm sure you can't detect from the tone of my voice what my political opinions are whatsoever. But just in case you can, I think I will move on. Right, in terms of a challenge at this point, if you can add anything based on your knowledge you gained from the lessons on kingship and chivalry with Miss Malt to your list, then please do so. If not, pause the video, take a moment to digest what we've just been discussing, and write down a couple of words that you might use to describe a hero or a king. What you could do potentially at this stage is a quick Venn diagram in which you think, okay, these are the qualities that are just relevant to a hero. These are the qualities that are just relevant to a king, and which qualities actually would apply to both heroes and kings. You might wonder whether you can be both a hero and a king at the same time. And we'll review this information and these opinions later in the lesson when we've looked at more of the text. So pause the video, add to your notes. Okay, so who are the heroes and the kings that we're going to be focusing on? Well, you'll know already that our main hero, or the person that's assumed to be heroic, or we're told is heroic at the start of the play, is Macbeth. And we'll come on to the language used to describe his heroic traits and his heroic deeds in a minute. Our king, of course, is King Duncan. Okay, kindly King Duncan. So, as I've said to you today, we're going to be focusing on Act 1, Scene 2. And in doing that, we're going to be answering the question, how does Shakespeare introduce King Duncan, Macbeth and Banquo to the play, and what are our first impressions of them? Now, that'd be an important question for us to consider throughout the lesson and then to answer at the end. So we're going to read and watch parts of the scene, just like we did yesterday. We're going to analyse the scene, zooming in on some important quotes and details. And as I said, we'll finish with writing a paragraph answering the question above. Okay, so it's only a week or so since you did your summaries of each scene, so I won't spend ages recapping. I'll put this information just on the screen for you to pause and read if you've completely forgotten what the sort of events of Act 1, Scene 2 are. Now, I've put a box around that section because that's the bit that we're going to focus on. We're not going to read every line of Act 1, Scene 2. We're going to look at a slightly abridged version. And what abridged means, it's just been shortened, it's been edited, just to save a little bit of time and to give us a bit more focus. Now, you'll have already printed off the abridged version of Act 1, Scene 2 that I've put on Show My Homework, and that will be in front of you ready for your notes. But we're going to be focusing on the captain's report. So the captain, who in the script is actually referred to as the sergeant, he's returned from the battlefront and he sees King Duncan, and he reports on the exploits, on the achievements of Macbeth and Banquo in battle. So we're going to focus on that report and that description in today's lesson. Okay, as I said, in case you've completely forgotten what happened in Act 1, Scene 2, you could have paused this screen, jotted down a couple of notes, or read through the screen, read through the information, and then we'll move on. Okay, like yesterday, we'll pause at this point just to watch a film version on this occasion of Act 1, Scene 2. So this film version of Macbeth, I think, was made in the 1970s, although don't quote me on that. And we'll just watch this short clip that gives us a depiction of the events.
bloody man is that? Hail, great friend! Say to the king my knowledge of the broil as thou didst leave it.
Doubtful it stood. The merciless MacDonald led his rebellion from the western Nile, and fortune on his damned coral smiled. But brave Macbeth,
Well, he deserves that name.
carved out a passage till he faced the slave, and ne'er shook hands nor bade farewell to him till he had seen them from the nave to the chop.
Valiant cousin, worthy gentleman.
Upon this chance, did the Norwegian king with furbished arms and new supplies of men begin afresh assault.
Made not this our captain Macbeth and Duncan?
Cat, as sparrows, eagles, or the hare alive.
So well thy words become thee as thy wounds. They smack upon a boat. Go get him surgeon. What said the king? What news, my worthy thane?
Norway himself, with terrible numbers, assisted by this most disloyal traitor, that Thane of Cawdor, began a dismal conflict, till that Bellona's bridegroom, bold Macbeth, confronts the king, rebellious arm against arm, curbing his lavish spirit. To conclude, the victory fell on us.
Great happiness! No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. So pronounce his person's death. And with this former title, greet Macbeth.
Okay, so one interesting thing to note there is that we actually see King Duncan and his noblemen ride into the scene once the battle is finished. So all the hard work is done. The king turns up and kind of then gives orders as to what's to happen next. And as you know, what is to happen next is that the treacherous, the disloyal Thane of Cawdor is to be executed. And you see the king swoop down with his sword and pluck the chain that represents his role as Thane of Cawdor from around his neck and orders it to be given to Macbeth instead. So you now will need to have your copy of Act 1, Scene 2 in front of you. And like yesterday, I'm actually going to ask you to work independently as far as you can. So the first section of Act 1, Scene 2 that I've asked you to look at is up on the screen. As with yesterday, I've emboldened some details that you might look at. Now, you can look at whatever details you like and you can explore whatever meaning you like, but I've just given you some hints as to the types of things you might look at. So the use of bloody man, that image, the question mark there, we might consider whether a king would be asking a question is the first thing he says. And then we've got this word seemeth. He seems to, it seems to be the case. Just before you make your notes, there's some information up in the top left about Forres, which you might find useful, might help you to inform, or might help to inform your understanding. And we might ask ourselves, like I said, whether the question that he opens with dilutes, it kind of reduces his power and his status. And as I said, we're going to be looking at that question mark, that opening question, that opening line there. So pause the video, spend a couple of minutes, if you can, adding notes with your thoughts on Duncan's opening words. Okay, now you've had the chance to do that. We'll just spend a couple of minutes looking at some of those details together. So if we look at the stage direction, a camp near Forres, and we consider that Forres is a place in Scotland that was and is still linked to witchcraft and to the supernatural, we might think, oh, Duncan seems to be in close proximity to this place that is renowned for being a supernatural place, for being a place inhabited by witches. And at the moment, he doesn't seem to understand the implications of that or the threat that that poses. So he's physically, he is close to the supernatural, but he's not aware of that presence or of the threat it poses. Now, King James I, watching, would very much be aware of that place and its connotations and the threat posed, because, as it says, he, when King of Scotland, he was extremely harsh in his persecution and execution of witches, having over 2,500 of them executed. Now we've got this opening question, and we might think, well, actually, all seems in order here. The scene opens and King Duncan speaks first. So he's the authoritative figure, he's in control. So he takes command and he speaks first. But he doesn't speak in orders or statements. He actually asks a question. What bloody man is that? And that could suggest that he's uncertain, that he's not in command or in control of the situation. And we might consider the image of the bloody man approaching. Now, that bloody man, as we know, is the captain or sergeant who's about to give him information about what happened on the battlefield and what Macbeth and Banquo's role was. But it seems like quite a sinister image, quite a threatening image. And it kind of foreshadows the fact that Duncan is being approached by someone who potentially could cause him harm, is associated with violence. And as we know later on, that person is Macbeth. The bloody man approaching is not Macbeth, but it seems to be a metaphor to foreshadow that later threat posed to Duncan by Macbeth. And we can see an image here of Michael Fassbender playing Macbeth in the most modern adaptation of the play. And here we see him as the soldier, as the warrior at the start of the play, and he looks like that bloody man, that threatening figure that's approaching, something almost ghostly actually. Duncan continues, he can report as seemeth by his plight of the revolt the new estate. Now we don't have to worry about all of that, but what I would say we might think about in terms of this word seemeth, he just seems uncertain. He hasn't actually participated in the battle himself, he hasn't taken part, and he's going to rely on others to tell him what happens. Now that's quite a dangerous position to be in. Once again, therefore, his authority or his power is somewhat undermined. If you see things firsthand, then you can make correct decisions. For example, if I was to see a fight on Penfield one break time, if I saw it myself, I'd be in a position to make those decisions, to act accordingly. And I'd be able to trust what I'd seen because I'd seen it with my own eyes, heard it with my own ears. But he's relying on someone else to tell him about it and then make decisions off the back of it. So it's the equivalent of someone coming up to me and saying, sir, this has happened on Penfield and this person did this and that person said that and they went first and this person filmed it on their camera. And yet I'm expected to make a sensible, balanced, accurate decision based on that information. Well, it ain't going to happen, is it? I should say for clarity, just for anyone watching who doesn't go to Oldfield School, that there are never fights on Penfield and there's no threat of violence or suggestion of hostility between any of our students. Okay, finally then, we spoke last lesson about Shakespeare sometimes being a bit cheeky, taking a few risks in kind of provoking and prodding the audience, especially the royal audience, into some kind of uncomfortable territory, telling them and showing them some things that they might not like particularly. So Shakespeare here could be implying that by staying out of the direct combat in order to preserve his status, because obviously Duncan wasn't going to get involved in the fight because he thinks it might be a threat to his life, he's actually reduced his authority by doing that and made himself more vulnerable. We've spoken already today about heroes and kings. We might argue that it's not very heroic to sit back, watch the battle unfold, and then come in afterwards. It actually means that he hasn't had that experience, and that could make him, as we've said, more vulnerable, less powerful. We know that he's already a king under attack. Okay, so before the play and in this battle that's taken place, the Irish forces have been threatening him with this character MacDonald. We've got Norway as a threat. We know that we've got the witches as a potential threat from Act 1, Scene 1. And he's kind of enhancing the threat that he's faced with by not confronting it himself. Now, this is a risky political point for Shakespeare to be making because his play is being paid for and watched by King James I. So he has to tread carefully here, and he does that, and we'll come back to that later on. Right, on to the next section. Right, now this is a longer section, as you will see. Again, you can pause the video in a second and make your own notes independently. I've added a few questions around the screen to help you to do that. Remember, you don't need to cover everything. If you're thinking, oh, I just want to focus on the really important details, the bits that I've emboldened in the sergeant or captain's speech could be particular areas for your focus. So pause the video, maybe spend 5-10 minutes picking that particular section apart, and then we will go through it together. Okay, so Malcolm kicks us off here by saying, say to the king the knowledge of the broil, the fight, the conflict, as thou didst leave it. So Malcolm is basically saying there, right, tell the king what happened. And we'll come back to Malcolm's lines in a second. But before we do, if you remember one thing from this particular section, from this particular slide, then I want it to be this focus on the famous and often used quote, brave Macbeth. Now, there will be hundreds of thousands of GCSE students next year who have studied Macbeth, and I would put good money on the fact that most of them, if not all of them, will use the quote, brave Macbeth. But here's the thing, and this will put you Oldfield students at an advantage. Most of them will actually interpret that, maybe if not incorrectly, they won't interpret it as accurately as you will, based on what I'm about to tell you. So when we think of brave Macbeth, we're all just going to be thinking, well, that shows he's honourable, that shows he's valiant, he's heroic, he's someone who will throw himself in harm's way to sort of benefit his country. He's brave Macbeth, that's his title. However, it isn't as simple as that. Now, the definition of brave, as we just said, someone who is courageous, someone who is valiant, fearless. They are ready to face and endure danger or pain. Okay. But then interestingly, if we look at the origin of the word brave, where the word brave comes from, and we track it back through time, we will see that in the late 15th century, and Shakespeare was alive in the sort of late 16th century, the word brave meant barbarous. Now, some of you might already be thinking, oh, wow, okay, that's interesting. If you're not sure what the word barbarous means, it means this. It means extremely brutal, cruel, barbaric, brutish. It can also mean, that second definition, primitive and uncivilized, like that person is some kind of savage, that they are a barbarian. Okay. And suddenly what we've got is an image not of Macbeth, this kind of superhero who's doing everything in a courageous and valiant way. What we've got potentially is an image of him being brutal and bloodthirsty. Okay. So we've got that idea that Macbeth is not this brave hero, but he's in fact a brutal, uncivilized, savage killer. Okay, so let's go through the questions briefly. What do you think about Malcolm's language and Donalbain's silence? Well, you might have forgotten all about Donalbain, because most people who watch and study Macbeth do. And that's because he's a bit of a coward. And as soon as Duncan is killed, he disappears. He legs it off to Ireland and he doesn't come back. That's Donalbain done for the whole play. Malcolm, on the other hand, who we know becomes King of Scotland in the end, seems to be taking control here. He seems to have some authority. Say to the king. So he's already using imperative language. He's commanding. And like we said, that foreshadows that he's eventually going to become king. He potentially seems more authoritative, more powerful than his dad. So how would we describe the tone of the sergeant's speech, and at what pace do you think it should be read on stage? Well, that's quite subjective. That's going to be up to you. We might say that it's all sounding quite excited. He was going to be kind of still full of the adrenaline of battle. So he might sound quite excited, quite enthusiastic about what he's seen. And we might also have that idea that he's being slightly hyperbolic. He's exaggerating. So his tone is potentially a bit over the top. And we might think that he's going to read that quickly because he's excited, or maybe because he's knackered, because he's just been in a big brawl. He might read it quite slowly. And he might also read it slowly to emphasize how admiring he is of Macbeth and of Banquo, how much in awe he is of those events that he's seen. Okay, so we've got then the words multiplying and swarm. What do the words multiplying and swarm imply about the threat that Scotland faces? We see them here. Previously, the sergeant has talked about the merciless MacDonald, who we know as this traitor. Says he's worthy to be a rebel, for to that the multiplying villainies of nature do swarm upon him from the Western Isles. So we've got the idea that treachery and these kind of rebellions against Scotland, or these attacks upon Scotland, are a sickness, a disease. The idea of something multiplying, something swarming, It seems plague-like almost. And we'll remember back from Act 1, Scene 1, the fair and foul fog we said is like sickness and disease. It's like pollution. It's like plague. So we've got that sense there that Scotland is facing this plague, facing this sickness. We've then got these words, villainies of nature and damned. And I've asked you to think about what they suggest about an attempted attack on the king. So it's basically saying that if you try to commit regicide, if you try to be treacherous and commit treason against your country, if you are disloyal, well, you're going against nature. You're a villain, and if you're damned, you're going to hell. So it's not going to end well for you if you attempt to overthrow the king and to attack Scotland. Okay, on a couple of occasions, both here and Fortune on his damned quarrel smiling, and then down here, brave Macbeth, who is disdaining Fortune, he's dismissing Fortune, okay? He's rejecting Fortune. We might wonder a couple of things. We might think, well, Fortune could be linked to money, could be linked to wealth, and therefore it could be suggesting that the attacks on Scotland are motivated by greed. So MacDonald and by association the Thane of Cawdor, the old Thane of Cawdor, have behaved in a greedy way. They've chased money, they've chased the prize, and they've lost. Now, the irony there is that Macbeth, who at the moment is being described maybe in a positive light, well, he ends up chasing fortune. He ends up chasing status. So, in fact, the sergeant's kind of dismissal of fortune, his negative attitude towards fortune, turns out to be a negative attitude towards Macbeth as well. Because as I've said, later in the play, Macbeth chases fortune. He becomes greedy for power, and he rightly suffers as a result. Okay, the other thing on fortune briefly is that fortune can be to do with luck. So he basically thinks that people have tried their luck. People have taken a chance in attacking Scotland. They've tried it on, but brave Macbeth and his army, along with Banquo, his co-general, have just sent them packing. Okay, the key images of the scene. Now, there are numerous key images in this scene, but one we might focus on is this one that I've highlighted here, that he's disdaining fortune, and then with his brandished steel, which smokes with bloody execution. So we've got the idea that Macbeth has this brandished steel, his sword, and this sword is smoking with bloody execution. Now, why would it be smoking? Well, maybe that has connections with the supernatural. That idea that he's got this burning kind of supernatural sword suggests that he's not from this earth. He's abnormal. It could also, on a more sort of physical, literal level, have been smoking because A, he's in Scotland and Scotland is cold, and B, that sword would have been covered in blood. Now, blood is hot, 37 degrees centigrade. When you take out into the cold, what's going to happen? Well, smoke's going to rise from that sword. So you're going to have this quite sort of scary, supernatural image of this warrior brandishing his sword, which is covered in blood and is smoking. So again, it makes him look threatening. Potentially, it could make him, in the eyes of some, look pretty cool. This is a heroic warrior. This guy's just slain a bunch of people. So it could make him look sort of like a superpower. Alternatively, it could make him look supernatural and therefore be threatening. And I mentioned earlier that idea of brave meaning also barbarous. And we can see in this image this idea of this brutal warrior with, we see his brandished steel. And we also get the idea that he's a butcher. He's someone that is able to cut people up. Now, if you look at this description at the end, this rather gory description, and I said yesterday that there's some biology in the play in terms of human body parts. Well, we'll need that knowledge now, because when the captain says that Macbeth unseamed him, so this is MacDonald, unseamed him from the nave to the chaps and fixed his head upon our battlements. Well, to unseam someone from the nave to the chaps, as you saw demonstrated in the film, is to cut them from the navel, from the belly button, up to their chops, their chaps, their jaw, basically cut them open. You might use the word eviscerate to describe that action, to gut someone. So Macbeth has gutted this person like an animal, and then cut his head off, as we see here, stuck it up on the battlements. Now that links to later on in the play, and this is another example of foreshadowing, in that, well, whose head ends up upon the battlements at the end of the play in Act 5, Scene 8? Well, it's Macbeth's head that ends up on the battlements. So the guy who's doing the beheading becomes the beheaded. And in that final scene, Malcolm describes Macbeth as this dead butcher, and describes Lady Macbeth as his fiend-like, fiend meaning devil, his fiend-like queen. So this image of Macbeth being violent and being monstrous in a way, that's described in this second scene, is still the case in Act 5, Scene 8. But by this time, they've realised that his intentions and his actions aren't heroic at all. They're actually murderous and treacherous, and that's why they need to get rid of him. So a man that was once a hero, once brave Macbeth in the positive sense, is now very much brave Macbeth in the negative sense, the savage. And that goes back to that idea of him being barbarous. So last couple of bits. Foreshadowing, we've mentioned a few things. I don't think we need to mention any others, maybe apart from this whole idea of Macbeth carving out a passage. This is an interesting image of Macbeth seeing MacDonald, and it's like one of those scenes from a film. We get towards the conclusion of a violent film, and we see there's going to be this face-off between the kind of lead good guy and the lead bad guy. And Macbeth, the lead good guy at this stage, sees MacDonald across the battlefield, kind of plows through the crowd, sort of casting people off left and right, carving out his passage to MacDonald. And at that point, he faces MacDonald, who's described as a slave here. And he does what we described earlier. He cuts him open, chops his head off, sticks it up on the battlements. Nice work, Macbeth. In terms of this end bit here, what are your thoughts on Duncan's reaction to the report? Well, you see a couple of exclamation marks, lots of positive adjectives. Macbeth is valiant. He's worthy. Well, Duncan is waxing lyrical about Macbeth at that stage. Well, what that means is he's full of admiration for him. And what we want to remember is, like we said earlier, he's responding to what he's been told, not what he's seen, but what he's been told. He's getting that information secondhand, and then he's using that information to make decisions. And we might wonder whether that's particularly wise for a king to do. But Duncan is completely taken with this idea of Macbeth. Okay? If we go back to a football analogy, it's like a manager of a team being told that this player is awesome, that he scored the best goal ever, that he tackled everyone on the pitch, that his energy was relentless, and the manager never watching a video of that player, just going, yeah, sign him up. In fact, make him captain, put him on the most wages in the team. Doesn't make much sense, does it? But Duncan is saying, oh, valiant cousin, worthy gentleman. Now, I think it was mentioned in a previous lesson that cousin is meaning that Duncan is literally a blood relative of Macbeth, his cousin. He's not. Okay? Cousin in Elizabethan Jacobean England meant someone that is closely associated with them, as well as someone who can be a blood relative. So when Duncan calls Macbeth a valiant cousin, that just means someone who's brave that he feels close to. It doesn't mean that Duncan and Macbeth are related. And he says, worthy gentleman. At the moment, we kind of wonder, well, what's he worthy of? What's Duncan going to give Macbeth? And in terms of how the audience therefore might react to Duncan's words, well, I know how I'm reacting to Duncan's words. I'm thinking, what are you doing, Duncan? You're supposed to be a smart, experienced king, and you're just taking someone else's word for it, and you're going to make all of these brash decisions about making this valiant, worthy gentleman Thane of Cawdor, and you don't know what you're letting yourself in for. And then in terms of themes established or continued in this extract, well, you maybe have spotted this already, but the most obvious one to me is the one of appearance versus reality. Okay, superficially on the surface, there's the appearance that Macbeth is a hero and that he's loyal to his king and that he does everything possible to defend his country. He's patriotic and he's willing to put himself in danger to do the right thing. But beneath that surface, what we actually have is reality, and the reality takes us back to this word brave, meaning savage, and this image of this brutal killer. And that's the reality. So appearance, he's a hero, but in reality, he's a brutal killer. That's what he's trained and done for his whole adult life. Okay, we're now on to the next section. Again, if you pause that, use the questions up on the right-hand side to jot down your own notes, and I'll be back with you in a minute to go through those few lines. Okay, welcome back. So just to go through these lines briefly, and again, if there's too much detail in this for you, if you're thinking, well, there's no way I'm going to be able to study the whole play like this, so there's no way I'm going to be able to go through every line, every scene and make this many notes. Well, no, you're not, and you don't need to. But I'm just giving you an idea about how much possibility there is in this text for exploration, and just giving you a kind of sense of how you can, by focusing in on details and looking at possible meanings, really gain a good understanding, a good independent and sophisticated understanding of the play and of Shakespeare's choices. And for those of you who will be sat there going, yeah, but do you actually think Shakespeare meant to do that? Because that's just like us, just overanalyzing everything. Well, Shakespeare was a genius. So I don't think that he did many things by accident. I think our interpretations can be different over time, but I don't think that we want to undermine Shakespeare's skill by saying, yeah, this is all just an accident. We're just weirdos who like overanalyzing everything. Right. In terms of what impression do these lines create about King Duncan, Macbeth and Banquo? Well, Duncan has kind of heard this report of the battle, and he says, dismayed not this, our captains, Macbeth and Banquo. So he's saying, does this not freak them out? Does this not dismay them? Did this not scare them to see this brutal scene? And he calls them our captains, which again has got that sporting theme that seems to be running throughout today's lesson. Our is a possessive pronoun, something belonging to us, to me. And he might be referring to our as in him as the king. Banquo and Macbeth and the army are his belongings, his captains, but he could be referring to Scotland as well. So our could be either him, the king, his people, his stuff, or Scotland's people, Scotland's generals, Scotland's heroes. So he says, did this whole thing not scare them? Did this not freak them out? And the sergeant says, yes. And here he's being sarcastic, because he says, yes, it scares them as sparrows scare eagles. So obviously, you know, the average eagle isn't too scared of the average sparrow, or the hare, the lion. So again, he's being sarcastic, he's being cheeky, he's saying, of course it didn't scare them. These men are eagles, they're lions. They don't get scared by sparrows and hares. How ridiculous. And the sergeant continues, if I say sooth, I must report. I must report. He feels kind of compelled, obliged to say, I need to tell you this. And the question here was, can you spot any warning signs? And maybe we'll think about whether there are any warning signs in this language in a sec. Because he says that Macbeth and Banquo were cannons overcharged with double cracks. So they doubly redoubled strokes upon the foe. Okay, so that might seem like it's kind of action-packed, energetic. They're kind of awesome fighters, awesome warriors. They're like overcharged cannons. They double strike their enemies. And then when they think they've got nothing left to give, they redouble their efforts. They come again and they beat and batter their opponents into submission. It also could suggest, this repetition of double, that they come as a pair, Macbeth and Banquo. Okay, they're a team. They are indivisible. Okay, you get one, you get both. Remember, they are co-generals. And the question at the start of the lesson asked you to think about the impressions of Macbeth and Banquo. Well, the only real impression we're getting is of Macbeth. If we're thinking anything of Banquo, it's that he's being ignored. He's kind of being relegated to kind of co-star or also ran, rather than the hero that Macbeth is being greeted as. Back to this briefly, I wonder whether the sergeant is actually giving us a bit of a warning here. I must tell you, I must report that they were not just cannons, they were overcharged cannons. They were overexcited. They were almost excessively too brutal, too forceful. The other thing to notice here is that cannons don't control themselves. They're controlled. Cannons are objects. They're instruments of war, weapons of war. And they're actually, as I said, they are controlled by others. So that's an interesting point about Macbeth and Banquo. You get the sense that maybe if they're given too much control, too much power, that they actually become incredibly dangerous. And we know that becomes true of Macbeth later in the play. So the sergeant's possibly giving us a warning here that these cannons need to be treated with caution. They need to be controlled, otherwise they get carried away. And if they're given too much responsibility, they are a threat. Okay, so from this scene, we've potentially got the idea that Banquo and certainly Macbeth pose a threat. Let's see if that continues as the scene continues. Before I say anything else, we can pause the video again, have a look at those questions up here, spend a few minutes writing down your own ideas about some of this language. As always, things you might be interested in are emboldened. Okay, pause the video, have a go. Okay, nearly there, nearly at the end of the scene. So Duncan says, "No more than Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest." No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest. Now this line is loaded with irony. Because in terms of bosom interest, we see the word bosom here, he's referring to Scotland, but he's also referring to himself. So the old Thane of Cawdor, the guy who he's just said or has said is going to be executed, he was a threat to the king, to Duncan, and he was a threat to Scotland. And Duncan declares here quite confidently, "No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive." Okay, we're not going to be fooled any longer by him. He's been caught, he's been found out, he's going to be executed. He says, "Go pronounce his present death." Now, where Duncan is again shown to be a bit naive and a bit of a fool here is in the irony of these lines, because who becomes Thane of Cawdor? Well, it's Macbeth. Who kills Duncan? Macbeth. So when Duncan says, "No more that Thane of Cawdor shall deceive our bosom interest," there's this horrible irony that he doesn't realise that actually the person he's about to give the title to, the new Thane of Cawdor, will be responsible directly for his own death, his own downfall. Duncan's a little bit, if we think about the bosom interest image, he's a little bit kind of exposing himself. It's kind of like he's taking his shirt off, he's taking his armour off and making himself exposed, making himself vulnerable. And then he confirms that by saying, "Give the former title to Macbeth." And he's greeting Macbeth. Okay. Later on, we see Lady Macbeth and Macbeth welcome Duncan to their castle, and that's where Duncan gets murdered. Here, Duncan welcomes Macbeth to his bosom. Okay, if you can suppress your chuckles for a minute, Macbeth is allowed close to Duncan. So this is like Duncan, the big sort of bloated turkey, inviting the tiger round for dinner. Okay, Ross then just says, "Yes, I'll see it done." Duncan says, "What he hath lost, he being the Thane of Cawdor, noble Macbeth hath won." So Duncan is kind of declaring the winner here, and in doing so, he's declaring himself the loser. So what we can see from these words is that Duncan, sorry, that was awful. What we're seeing here is that Duncan is not the wisest, not the smartest of kings. He's naive, he's silly, and he's blind. He doesn't see his own downfall when it's standing right in front of him. Okay, so we've got reflections quickly on the idea of Macbeth as hero and Duncan as king. And you can decide for yourselves whether you think Macbeth now qualifies as a hero and whether you think Duncan qualifies as being a good king. We might also think later on, when Macbeth becomes king, is he these things, or does he, because of his egotistical ways, does he actually forget to be all of these things that a good king should be and actually become a dictator, a tyrant, a monster, someone that ends up being completely disrespected by his country to the extent where they want and need to get rid of him. And as you already know, they do. Final thing on this, I think we need to, like I mentioned in the last slide, not think of King Duncan as this wise, knowledgeable man full of perceptive kind of vision. He doesn't see things. Ironically, unlike the witches, he is in fact a blind mouse. So whilst we've got the witches, these kind of supernatural outsiders, seeing everything, knowing everything, We've got the King of Scotland, the guy who's supposed to be in charge of all of this, the guy who's appointed by God, sees nothing, completely blind. And again, Shakespeare might be taking a few risks by making this connection for those to those people that might pick up that link that Shakespeare's kind of suggesting. Okay, so we now get on to that question. How does Shakespeare introduce King Duncan, Macbeth and Banquo to the play, and what are our first impressions of them? So we'll pause the video at this stage. You might want to spend 10 minutes, however long you need, to answer that question. I'd suggest to do it justice, you use at least 100 words, and as ever, use specific evidence and quotes to support your points of view. You might consider these three things. Who gives us these impressions? So who gets to define Macbeth and Banquo? Are Macbeth and Banquo considered equals? And what does King Duncan seem like in comparison, especially to Macbeth? Now, I expect you'll write a lot more about King Duncan and Macbeth than you will about Banquo, but it's worth noting, worth including, that Banquo isn't really included at this stage, and therefore Macbeth seems to gain more status and more importance at this stage. Okay, pause the video, have a go. Okay, well done. Thanks for doing that last task. We're there. We've done it. We've got to the end of Act 1, Scene 2, and you've now got a university level of understanding of everything that goes on. I'd say that even if you've understood and kind of digested about 20% of what we've done today, then you'll have a more than good enough understanding of this scene. Just to sum things up, like last lesson, use the sort of chemical formula method to sum up the scene. You might want to use some of the images below, and then pat yourself on the back, because Act 1, Scene 2 and part 1 of today's lesson is done. So I'll see you for part 2. For the record, you don't have to do part 2 straight away after this, because your brain's busting a little bit. You might need a little break. So have that break, but please come back to Act 1, Scene 3 in part 2 later on, because it will be worthwhile for you. Okay? Do your summary and then give yourself a well-earned break. Thanks.